Hi artists, Shelly here. Today I am painting a portrait of Sean Cannell from Think Media. I was watching Sean on YouTube and I was intrigued by the warm and cool lights hitting his face. Today I thought I'd show you how I prepare my palette, starting with the mixing of the skin tones. Here's a look at all the paints I have on my palette, and I'll be sure to put the description of the paint colors that I'm using in the description. I'm going to mix my skin tones so that I have a neutral version of a specific color, and then I want to have a warmer version, and then I'm going to have a cool version. And I'm going to put the warm ones on the left side and the cool ones on the right side, just like I'll be painting it on the portrait of Sean. You can see he's got warm light hitting the face on the left and cool light hitting the face on the right. This will be a good lesson in painting with temperatures rather than values. You can see here in the black and white version, there's not a lot of value changes, there's no dramatic lighting, and so in order to punch up the 3D effect of the face, we're going to have to rely on temperature changes rather than value and lighting changes. And in order to get a cool version of the skin tone and a warm version of the skin tone, it's helpful to have a warm and a cool red on your palette. And I've got the cool version of red by way of Elysian Crimson and the warm version by way of Cadmium Red Light. And you'll also see there's some orange on my palette as well, for me being able to punch up any areas of really hot, warm light on that left side of Sean's face. I just wanted to have it on there. It's going to really allow me to punch that up in those areas. Now I'm just mixing up enough colors to get started, and as you guys have seen me painting before, I'll end up making some new colors along the way from the colors that I initially mix. But I like to have my mid values in the middle of my palette, light values at the bottom, and dark colors at the top. All right, now we're going to start. I've got a little grid here. It's a 12 by 12 canvas, equal grids, which makes it 3 by 3 squares. And I'm going to start by painting Sean's left eye. Now you know I like to do the selective start method, so I'm going to be going in here with the pupil and then building out from there. I like to check that I have the pupil in the correct spot with the proportion tool. Now you can see it was not in the right spot, but that's no big deal. I just wiped it flat, and then I'll start where I know it should, and I'll put the iris color just on top of where I smushed that pupil out of the way with my finger. That's the beauty of oil paint, no fear, just dive in, start, and that's a great way to get better at drawing, is to put down what you think you see and then check it with the proportion tool. And eventually you'll start seeing more and more that you are nailing that initial brushstroke and putting it in the correct right spot. Take your time with the initial start, getting the pupil and the iris put down in the correct spot. Measure it with your proportion tool or ruler, whatever you have on hand, and that way you know everything that you paint going forward, because you're building onto from this placement, is going to more than likely be in the right spot. So those of you that don't know Sean Cannell, he's really the guru go-to channel on YouTube to learn all about having a YouTube channel and learning how to use specific equipment, which camera is good, which mics are good, and he's been really helpful in me growing my YouTube channel and learning how to make better videos for you guys. So if any of you are looking into starting or improving a YouTube channel that you may already have, Sean Cannell's a great resource, and you can find him at Think Media. He also has a channel called Think Marketing, and there's also a podcast. And just, he's a wealth of information. Him and his team, they're really good at getting right to the point and telling you what it is you need, or perhaps what it is you don't need. And I was just watching him the other day, and the lighting in this video was just, it kept capturing me. It was so cool the way he had a warm light on the left side and this cool kind of glowy light on the right side. And I just decided, okay, I have to paint it. And it's really cool when you can take an image from video like YouTube, because it's usually a lot of talking head videos, and you can freeze frame the person in motion. It's not like you're painting a portrait where someone's just seated and they're posing for you. You're really capturing them in their essence, in their when they're explaining something, they're excited, they're talking, you're really getting a good look on the face. I feel like it's something that I've enjoyed doing. I've done some other portraits in the past. You can find, I have a playlist. It was my take on portrait artists of the year, and I was doing it Shelley J style. And I always thought that taking images from YouTube for that as a good way to prepare myself, just in case Sky Arts ever brought Portrait Artist of the Year to the United States, because right now it's just for artists in the UK. And I love that show as well, and it was just a lot of fun. And I figured taking names out of my little purse so that I didn't know who I was painting, and grabbing their images off of YouTube, because most of the people were from YouTube at the time, and painting them. So that's where I figured out painting a portrait from a freeze framed video image is really cool. I suggest you guys give it a try. Alright, we've moved through pretty much the left eye. We've got the white of the eye down, and the really cool effect, if you can see it, you may have to zoom in if you're on your phone, but just in that outer corner in the white of the eye is a really brighty, kind of orangey glow. And so we've painted most of the white of the eye in a really cool sort of grayed down color, and then this pop, this orangey, very light orangey highlight in that corner of his eye. I just really was excited to be able to paint that. And that's also the beauty of Selective Start. You get to really jump into some juicy bits right at the beginning. You don't have to wait. Hey, if you're getting value out of this, hit that thumbs up button, and don't forget to subscribe so that you can come along with me on my art journey. Also, if you're liking the selective style painting method for portraits and you want to learn more about it, now's a really great time. I've got a tutorial video and I'm offering it to you guys for half off all the way through till the end of August. I'll leave a link in the description where you can go to learn more. You can see on my palette how some of the initial piles of color have started to mix with some of the other piles of color to make new colors. And that's a great way to have a variety of skin tones throughout your portrait. And just remember that you're keeping the warm skin tones on the left side of the face and more cool to neutral skin tones on the right side of the face. And that's how we're going to build our 3D rather than using the effects of dramatic lighting and value changes. We're strongly relying on temperature and temperature changes, just the hot and coolness of the paint color. Alright, I'm going to let you guys just watch me paint this portrait and let it come to life a little bit, and I'll jump back in when I have some more information for you. And be sure to let me know if you have any questions. Okay, did you guys notice that I have moved into the more neutral and cool colors of the right side of the face? And I took a quick measurement there with the proportion tool to make sure I had the width of the bridge of the nose correct, because you definitely want to nail down the correct amount of space between the two eyes. And once I have the right eye painted in, I love to always take a proportion tool measurement from the inside of each iris, so it's an iris to iris measurement. And remember also that I have the computer monitor zoomed in so that the reference image is exactly the same size as what I am painting, so it's a 1-to-1 measurement. So whatever I see on the computer monitor is exactly what I'm going to paint. Therefore, I can take my proportion tool and measure between the iris on the left to the iris on the right and know that that distance is going to be whatever is showing on the proportion tool. See? And now I'm going to paint in the iris on the right, knowing that it's exactly where it should be. Also, as you're painting along and you're taking measurements, if you notice that something's not quite right, then go ahead and correct it then. Don't wait. So sometimes I use my grid lines for measuring, and other times I'm using the features that are on the face, more of a comparative type measurement. But either is good, and they're both great to check one another. So whenever you take a measurement, if you want, you can measure from one feature to the other and then also check it against one of your harder measurements from the grid line. One of the things that I love about capturing a portrait reference while someone's talking or in motion and not just posing, you get a lot of expression in the eyes. I mean, look at the expression in Sean's eyes. His eyebrows are raised slightly. He's definitely making a point. And I just feel like it's more fun to capture something like this in a portrait rather than just a static pose. I'm using a number 1 synthetic sable, and pretty much throughout the entire portrait, well, especially the features, I'm using this number 1 round, and I'm also using a number 4 flat. It's not until we move out of the features and towards the hair and the background when I switch over and grab some of my larger brushes. Okay, let's get this right eye painted. Okay, so right here I'm taking some measurements and I found that the outer corner of the right eye was coming in too close to the iris. So you can see that adjustment that I made there. And when I'm painting a portrait, I really like to get the majority of detail in the portrait done with the eyes. Now, if both eyes are on the level, on a plane where it's level, so they're equally distanced from the viewer, then both eyes are going to have the same degree of detail. Now, if it's more of a 3/4 view and one eye is closer to the viewer on the picture plane, then that eye that's closer is going to have a greater level of detail. And the one that's further away will be slightly less, not too painterly, but just slightly less detailed. And that can really help to punch up the vocal point. So if you want the vocal point in the portrait to be the eyes, which most times the vocal point of a portrait will be the eyes. So you can make a decision on how detailed or how in focus you want one or both eyes. And the other way to really solidify that the eyes are the vocal point is to have the most contrast happening in these areas, the two eyes or the one eye. And take your time with the transitions in the eyes. Don't be afraid to keep working on them. You may paint in a brush stroke and then paint over it and then just keep pulling and pushing the paint, the lightness, the darkness, the coolness, the warmness, and really make those transitions subtle. There's a lot of transitions that are happening around the eyes, and they should be subtle, especially even the iris where it is moving into the white of the eye. You don't want those dark outlines of the iris to be so stark and harsh moving into the white of the eye. Really work on trying to have that make the subtle transition, but you still want to have the good contrast there. So you're going to rely on some nice brush work in order for that to have the good contrast, but also the subtle transitions. So it's just something you have to practice and play around with, but the first thing to happen is to be aware of it. So just take your time with the transitions happening around the eyes. So notice also there is a slight tilt in Sean's head. So we wanted to make sure that we had that captured in the eyes. So you can see that the right eye is going to be slightly higher than the left eye, and it's going to let us see that his head is tilted towards the left. So the cool colors that are happening in the skin tones on the right versus the warm skin tones that are happening on the left side of the face. What I've done while I was mixing the colors and also while I'm painting is I'm being very conscious in really pushing that effect. So what I'm seeing in the reference image is not exactly what I'm putting down in my portrait. I'm really pushing that information. I'm putting the cool side even cooler and the warm side even warmer to really drive home that temperature difference. I really think it's going to make the portrait more effective and interesting to look at. Remember, you're the master of your portrait. You're not a slave to that reference image. Now, in portraiture, the main thing is to capture the likeness, and that will happen if you put the features in the correct spot and they're the correct shapes. It's not reliant upon the skin tone or the color temperature to capture the likeness. So that's where, once you have those features solidified and in place, you can have fun and really push the creativity in your portrait, and you'll still have that likeness. It'll still look like the person you're painting, but then the portrait will sing with interest and it will reflect you, the artist. Okay, now I'm going to work on a little bit of the forehead, and you can see Sean's raising his eyebrows and giving us these great expressive lines across the forehead. Now these can be tricky to paint. He's a pretty young man, so there's not a lot of lines. Older gentlemen can have many more lines, and sometimes you want to edit a few of those out. But with Sean, there's only a few here, so let's put them in. And the key is to work on them kind of like we were talking about with the eyes, and really making those transitions between each wrinkle line work. So they're going to be small, subtle transitions, but you have to get them in there. And the important thing with the lines across of anyone's forehead is you don't want them to be painted too harshly. Now I like to paint them in kind of harsh and then go back and soften them by laying brush strokes of the appropriate skin color on top of them and next to them, so that way you build the transition and soften the line at the same time. So if you're looking at the reference photo here of Sean, you can see there is the side on the left of the forehead. It has sort of a warm shadow. And then as you come across the front of the forehead, it's more lit, and part of that is warm and part of that is cool. And then you get to the far right side of the forehead, and if you look carefully, there's a shadow, but it's a cool shadow. So it's completely different thinking when you're working with skin tone color temperatures to denote the 3D effects of the face. So the forehead was a really great example of that. So as we walked from the left side of the forehead across towards the right side, we had to really pay attention to the color temperatures that we were using. There's not a great degree of change as far as values in the skin tones on the forehead, but there is a lot of color temperature change happening. So it was really important to me to punch up that warm side on the on the left of the forehead, and really emphasize the cool nature of that shadow on the right side of the forehead. So this is somewhat opposite of the thought process that happens when you're painting a portrait using more of a value change and dramatic lighting to drive home the idea and the look of a 3D face. So in those situations, you're really focusing on the fact that you have perhaps warm shadows and cool lights, or you may have warm lights and cool shadows. And when you're working with that situation, you have to stay true to whatever it is you initially start with. You can't make one shadow warm and one shadow cool. Then it won't read correctly, the lighting situation will be confusing, and more than likely your portrait will just be off in some way you may not even realize. So when you're working in a portrait that's really driven by color temperature, then you don't have to worry about sticking with one color temperature for lights and shadows. All right, let's get into painting that nose. Take a look at my palette. Now you can really see how I blend new colors from the initial piles. And it's okay, and you just really need to kind of mix the skin tones as you go that you need if you don't see what you want on your palette already. And that's cool. Just go ahead and mess up your palette. There's no reason to keep those colors separated and worry about, it's not the color I mixed initially. So you're going to always end up with a super messy palette. And I find the best portraits come from the messier palette. The messier, the better. You may notice I've moved over to using my number 4 flat brush. And now I get to paint his beard and goatee, which I love painting facial hair. I just think it's so interesting to have that kind of scruffy, scratchy texture against such a smooth thing as skin. And I love the contrast. Usually they're dark beards against the warm, sort of peachy colors of the skin. But there could also be an older gentleman and perhaps he has a silvery gray beard against that skin tone color. And I just love the contrast and the contrast of the color and the contrast of the texture. I think it's a really fun thing to paint. And you can experiment, get crazy with your brush marks, use different brushes. You might want to try an old scratchy frayed out brush, especially if you've laid down your darker colors, the sort of the undertone of the facial hair, then you can lay in your wispier, lighter hair colors with that scratchier, roughed up brush. And with that thought, it also makes me think of completing your alla prima portrait fully and letting it dry, and then coming back over top of it to really refine it and punch up the detail. So now you're doing an indirect painting. You're painting wet paint on top of dry paint. So with the selective start method, it's purely alla prima, wet into wet. And you can get pretty much a completed portrait in alla prima mode, definitely. But if you want to take your portrait to a really finished, refined level of detail, then let it dry and then go back over it. Go ahead into that indirect method. And that's going to allow you to do things like I mentioned, putting those scratchy hairs down on top of the more mid or darker value under colors of the beard. And then it'll also allow you to go in and maybe refine some of the transitions in the skin tones that perhaps weren't quite worked out fully in the alla prima painting session. And even with the hairs of the beard, I'm still keeping true to that cool on the right and warm on the left. Now I'm not going to get too detailed moving out away from the face. I like to leave the neck and the surrounding clothing, the background, really painterly and loose with brush marks that are interesting and fun to look at. And I've got a little bit of a trick coming up for you that I'm going to do towards the end. You'll see at the end of the video when I show you the finished portrait what I did. I just thought I'd have a little fun and pop something interesting in here that I haven't done before. So looking at the portrait at this point, what color background would you put in? And just to give you a time reference, this portrait took me about 4 hours to paint to completion. So that's why it's always a good idea if you complete an alla prima portrait and you feel like it's just not as refined as you want it to be, then you go ahead, let it dry, and then you come back in and now you finish on top of the dried portrait that you put down initially. That's a great way to start and have a fresh, lively, indirect portrait painting. All right, we're moving into that ear, and I always paint ears hot. So even though we're on the cool side of the face, there's still light showing kind of through that ear because the light's somewhat behind Sean. It's going to read as pretty hot, pretty red, and so I'm still adding some of that warm, hot red color into the ear that I normally do. And here comes my background, which you can now see. It's a sort of a bluish gray, a little bit of a darker blue color. I thought I'd pull a little bit of that bluish color in. It plays nice with the skin tones, I feel like. And you're going to see here just in a minute the little excitement detail that I put in. And I appreciate you guys watching. Thanks for being part of the channel, and I will see you in the next one. And here's a look at the finished portrait. And don't forget to check the description for the discounted tutorial.